Comrades, I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today in Sofia. Today, the 13th of May 2023, I was scheduled to come and speak to a meeting of comrades in Sofia, and it's with sadness that I couldn't make the trip. I was reflecting that as a young man, as a communist growing up in the West at the height of Thatcherite and Reaganite neoliberalism and Cold War rhetoric and propaganda, when I expressed communist ideas, ideals, beliefs, I was often told that if I liked communism so much, perhaps I should go and live in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in one of the Eastern Bloc countries. And actually I had a profound desire to visit those countries. I was lucky enough to visit Eastern Germany, the DDR, People's Democratic Republic. I was lucky enough to visit the Soviet Union in their final years. But I have never been to Sofia, to Bulgaria, and to many other Eastern European countries. And it is to my regret. This would have been a great opportunity to correct that and a good opportunity to come. I almost deliberately avoided visiting your countries in the collapse of, after the collapse of perestroika, revisionism, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the people's democracy, precisely because of the pain it caused me to see the reverses suffered by those peoples, your people, and the people of the world as a result of the rise of US imperialism and the fall of the power of the working class and our movement. But I want to thank you for inviting me to speak. I hope that this video will reach you in time and that you will have some means to relay it to your audience. And if not, we will anyway put it online, and I hope that you'll be able to view the comments that I would have made. Let me just quickly say that I continue to be inspired by the communist history of your country, Bulgaria, which despite the current reverses reached a far higher stage of development than the communist country in my country, the communist movement in my country, Britain, ever has done. I remember in particular one of the finest sons of the working class in the 20th century, Comrade Georgy Dimitrov. His defense in particular at the Reichstag show trial remains one of the finest examples of a revolutionary using the apparatus of an oppressive state, Hitlerite Germany, as a means not just for defending his own life, but for defending the revolutionary struggle of the oppressed and for passing damning judgment on imperialism itself. This fine tradition was also used in India by Bhagat Singh and his comrades against the British Imperial Raj, of turning the courtroom into a weapon against the accusers, was later continued by revolutionaries and national liberation fighters such as Fidel Castro and Nelson Mandela. It's worth just remembering some of Dimitrov's words which never fail to move me. Dimitrov said in that court, facing his Nazi accusers, Goering himself attended the trial. I admit that my tone is hard and grim. The struggle of my life has always been hard and grim. My tone is frank and open. I'm used to calling a spade a spade. I'm no lawyer appearing before this court in the mere way of his profession. I am defending myself, an accused communist. I'm defending my political honor as a revolutionary. I'm defending my communist ideology, my ideals. I'm defending the content and significance of my whole life. For these reasons, every word which I say in this court is a part of me. Each phrase is the expression of my deep indignation against the unjust accusation, against the putting of this anti-communist crime, the burning of the Reichstag, to the account of the communists. Georgy Dmitry Mikhailov was General Secretary of the Communist International, the Comintern, in the 1930s, and after the war, of course, went on to become the first leader of the People's Republic of Bulgaria. And since we recently celebrated 9th May, Victory Day, it's worth remembering, despite the passing of anti-communist legislation in many EU countries, the debt of gratitude we owe to the Red Army, the USSR, and the CPSUB and Third International, we will never accept the historical revisionism that they still use in their attempt to rebuild the greater European imperial project and to smash the confidence of the working class in building socialism. So, to more prosaic matters, my name is Ranjeet Brar. I'm a medical doctor by profession, but I've been a lifelong political activist since my teens. I've been a scientific socialist and Marxist-Leninist since I was old enough to read and comprehend the works. I remain a student of Marxism, of Engels, of Lenin, of Stalin, of the great revolutionary thinkers and teachers, and I'm involved in building a communist party in Britain, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, to give us our full moniker. And I'm a member of its Central Committee. We are a small party operating in one of the oldest capitalist nations, which long ago became a major colonial power, and even with the decline of that empire, remains a major financial power, and hence in alliance with the USA at the centre of NATO imperialism. Thus, also in my country, there's been a long history of alliance between a significant section of the working class, what Engels termed the labour aristocracy, and sometimes almost the whole of the working class, and our wealthy imperialist rulers, who could use some of the crumbs that came to them as the result of super-exploitation of their colonies to throw as a sop to increase the standard of life of workers and to buy their political acquiescence and even allegiance. The British Labour Party and its history reflect that alliance, and we are shortly to publish a booklet on the subject of their history, based on the longer work of Harpal Brar, Social Democracy, the Enemy Within, which is still available, and I invite comrades to get hold of a copy and read it. You can see it on our website. The corruption of the British Labour movement has led to the emergence of the Labour Party's social democracy, and Britain's Labour Party remains very much part of the imperialist state machine and the ruling establishment, albeit playing a second fiddle to the classic party of British capitalism, the Conservative or Tory party, who have been in power most recently in our country since 2010. Moreover, Britain's trade union movement and broader working class movement, including the so-called revolutionary or extreme left, are also overwhelmingly corrupted by the influence of Labour Party social democracy. And we have a profusion of small Trotskyite and semi-anarchist parties, of single-issue campaigns, whether that's anti-war, Palestine solidarity, or environmentalist or others, as well as revisionist communist parties, which trail in the wake of Labour Party, which is a party of imperialism. I've been asked specifically to talk about the European Union and Brexit, the Brexit referendum, the European Union referendum that was held in our country. Our party put forward our analysis of the European Union as a project at the time of the Brexit referendum in 2016. Principally, we put forward the analysis that, firstly, the European Union is an imperialist organisation. Secondly, that the EU represents an alliance of the major monopoly capitalist forces in Europe, which at that time were centred around Britain, Germany, France and Italy, with the Scandinavian, southern and eastern European countries playing a subsidiary but complementary role. Thirdly, that the EU and its policy was set up to preserve and maintain the leading role of finance capital in Europe and in the world. Fourth, that the EU is an organisation dedicated to the maintenance and intensification of the exploitation of the European working class, whilst noting the historical differentiation and gradation of that exploitation that exists within and between states. The EU, 5, is an organisation dedicated to the maintenance and intensification of exploitation of the so-called Global South, that we would more properly and scientifically term the formerly colonised countries, the neo-colonial and exploited nations and peoples. 6, that the EU is the economic vehicle most closely allied to the military programme of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, that is aimed at maintaining the domination of Anglo-American and European finance capital. That to all intents and purposes, despite the differences between member nation states, these are both vehicles of monopoly capitalist domination. And 7, and importantly, as you'll see, the EU in fact stands for a fortress Europe. It is a racist system of states based on colonial principles. As such, Southern and Eastern European nations enjoy lesser rights and privileges within the EU, while Africans, Asians, and Latin American migrants suffer a great deal of racism and discrimination within its borders. As such, it was clear to us then that as communists we should support British withdrawal from the EU, since it would clearly weaken British imperialism, weaken European imperialism, German, French, Italian, Spanish, Belgian, Dutch, Swiss, and weaken US imperialism. The question we were asked in the referendum was, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? And the responses were 1, remain a member of the European Union, or 2, leave the European Union. We called then and now for workers to vote to leave the European Union. Of course, our influence on British workers was, relatively speaking, tiny. Still, we put forward our slogan, but without making any false promises that this would solve the immediate economic and political problems of the working class, which were owing to far more deep and systemic problems of finance capitalism, namely 1, the exploitation of workers, of labour at the hands of capitalism, of capital. 2, the global crisis of overproduction, the cyclical crisis faced by capitalism which it can't escape, resting essentially on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, a crisis which is getting more deep and more widespread and more systemic each time it recurs and with each passing day. 3, the unemployment and the impoverishment of the working class, which has its fundamental root in the first 2 causes. 4, the reflection of these phenomena in the extension of credit, leading to a mountain of bad debt. How does capitalism maintain a demand when it's impoverished the workers to the point they can't buy the goods it's producing? It lends them money. It lends them money to buy houses, cars, lends them money on credit cards to buy consumables. But ultimately, sooner or later, the debt is bad debt. They can't repay it, precisely because they've been impoverished. It's just similar to the trick the United States is playing on a global scale. It lives on a mountain of bad debt that sooner or later will be called into question and lead to that system crumbling. And that accumulation of bad debt, of course, led to the credit crisis of 2008, and which in turn has led to an ongoing period of austerity, which has worsened the condition of living of the British people, and a similar phenomenon going on around the world in the imperialist nations. So since the Brexit vote, these problems have only intensified owing to the drive to war in order to intensify the exploitation of the global population, conflict with all independent states, especially with Russia and China, the exacerbation of global and economic dislocation as a result of the sanctions wars, the exacerbation of the global refugee problem and environmental problems as a result of the entire operation of their economic system, of the economic impoverishment and of those imperialist wars, and a deepening of energy problems in the EU, exacerbated and exacerbating all of the above contradictions that we've mentioned. And finally, the escalation of all those contradictions consequent upon the failure of the regime change war in Russia. Against Russia. Nonetheless, since the only way out of the crisis, for workers in particular and for humanity in general, is to end this system of exploitation, the weakening of imperialism by any means necessary is in our immediate interest, despite any short-term threat this may present to average living standards in Britain. That threat to our living standards is precisely because monopoly capital increasingly transforms the imperialist states into a parasitic body living as an excrescence, a parasitic excrescence living off the body of third world labour. And even though workers occupy a subordinate place in that hierarchy, our living standards are maintained off the back of that exploitation. But we could have a better life building and reconstituting society on an entirely different basis, and we maintain that. So to bring us back to the campaign around the referendum, we saw on the side of Remain interventions by Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, the majority of the Conservative Party, the so-called One Nation Conservatives, the majority of the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrat Party, the Green Party, the majority of business, the CBI, David Cameron, Theresa May, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, in short, the entire imperialist establishment in Britain and the global financial system were brought to bear on the side of Remain. They were joined, in fact, by the Trades Union Council, our organisation of trade unions, and the majority of individual British trade unions, all of whom claimed that workers' rights were being protected by our EU membership, a fact undermined and belied, called out as a lie by the real experience of workers with their increasing casualisation, marginalisation, decrease in standard of life, increase in zero-hour contracts, etc., etc., decrease in pension, decrease in pay and conditions, decrease in social services, attacks on the NHS. All of these things have happened whilst we've been members of the EU. So quite clearly, it's not an organisation dedicated to the rights of the working class. Labour, under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, even though Corbyn had historically been opposed to the EU, also supported Remain to stay in the EU. In fact, this was the kiss of death to Corbyn in his second general election campaign of December 2019, and the end of the Corbyn project to reclaim Labour, which was a fundamentally flawed project from its inception. As we've maintained, there was nothing to reclaim. This Labour Party is not a party of socialism, not a party of the working class. Campaigning for Leave, on the other hand, was a motley array of forces. Boris Johnson and a faction of the Conservatives, the European Research Group, falsely believed that British capitalism would do better outside the EU and that they could rekindle a second British Empire. Some thought that their special relationship with the USA would be stronger with Britain outside the EU, but that wasn't the opinion of the US establishment. The UK Independence Party and Nigel Farage. This was, of course, the foundational issue of UKIP, so-called. And the logic was very much that of the ERG, the European Research Group of Conservatives. Having made a party to promote this one-point programme, the rise of UKIP threatened to split the Tory party on a number of occasions, and in fact, arguably, this is the real reason that David Cameron called a referendum in the first place, in order to try and deal with his truculent colleagues. Most of the British left stood for remaining in the European Union, and their central argument was that leaving the EU meant standing with racists. But this reasoning was entirely spurious. We pointed out at the time and maintain today, there are no shortage of racists on either side of the Leave-Remain debate, including the Conservative Party, including the Labour Party, as its historical record not the preaching of some individuals towards its left wing, but its historical record, actions and deeds quite clearly show British imperialism is an endeavour that stands upon racism. Racism, anti-immigrating sentiment and rhetoric is the stock in trade of all the bourgeois parties in our country, and in fact throughout the capitalist world, when they offer workers the thin gruel of sinking lower and lower in order to maintain the profits of the capitalist elite, they always season it with a good dose of racism. And British Labour Party, Tory Party, all of our mainstream parties, in fact, are no exception to that rule. It was interesting to see that both London and Scotland voted by a majority for remaining in the EU, as did the north of Ireland. The deindustrialised working class areas of England, on the other hand, voted by a majority, and sometimes a very large majority, to leave. And there was a dual aspect to this. The extent to which anti-immigrant rhetoric influenced many voters was considerable. But the vote also reflected a deep sense of anger and betrayal at the declining life prospects in many working class areas, and a defiance against the British establishment, who quite clearly were applying pressure to vote to remain. So in June 2016, the British people voted, and the result was close but a significant victory for leaving, with 52% voting to leave the EU and 48% voting to remain. The British ruling class had asked the question, but in many ways they were not prepared for the answer, which sent a shock through the British imperialist establishment. The imperialist establishment, in fact, went into a tailspin and spent the entire 3.5-year period following that, right up until the election of December 2019 and the COVID crisis that came soon afterwards, dominated by parliamentary attempts to roll back, flout, water down the decision of the referendum in order to allow Britain in some way to remain a part of the wider European Union project. This in fact led to widespread discrediting of the political establishment in our country and all of the various bourgeois parties. There has been a state of permanent crisis within the Tory party ever since, leading to a series of infights and the installation of a succession of ever less convincing prime ministers and cabinets. It's become clear to the British workers that none of these charlatans has any answers to our problems. All of them are heavily anti-Russia, heavily anti-China. All of them are in favour of increased austerity. The concept of our successive administrations has been essentially to pass the burden of the economic crisis onto the backs of the working class. The 2020 stock market collapse that happened during COVID and was hidden largely by it, to the average worker at least, the ongoing expansion of money printing to bail out every failing bank and monopoly institution, were an extension and deepening of the economic crisis of 2008. As global finance stalks the globe, looking for a way out of its downward spiral, it's increasingly confronted by the rise of China, Russia, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but as we've seen recently, there's a host of countries queuing up to join, and the income of the BRICS nations now is starting to exceed the income of the G7 nations. It's a fundamental shift in the balance of power. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization nations, whose independence robs the financiers of their opportunities to maximize profits at the expense of the vast masses of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Let us look then at the results of Brexit. It still seems clear to us, to the extent that Brexit was implemented, that it has indeed exacerbated the crisis of European and British capital. It has exacerbated the splits between the various sections of our ruling class and deepened the divisions in the imperialist camp. It remains for us to build a working class movement that is able to take advantage of the divisions amongst our enemies and use them to advance the interests of the working masses. But we don't think that there is a way out for the European proletariat other than via the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system, by workers taking power into their hands and establishing a working class government. The truth remains that what we need is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and we can never fight shy as socialists of using the phrase, the term, expressing this as the direct interests of the working people. We need a working class state that will wrest all capital, all wealth by degrees from the exploiting imperial class who have monopolized it, wealth that we have produced, and building a planned economy to meet the needs of the masses of the working people. Though at present we are not capable of carrying out that program, we must focus all our efforts on building an organizations that are prepared to bring this outlook and understanding to the working class. Bringing a correct analysis of the current crisis to the revolutionary working class of all nations remains the shortest route to achieving our goals everywhere. And our party's work in the World Anti-Imperialist Platform is one contribution that we're making towards this pressing task for humanity. So in conclusion, comrades, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm sorry again that I couldn't be with you in your nation's capital today. I hope very much to take you up on the offer and see you again soon. And I wish you success in your endeavours building your party and with this meeting today.